Welcome back to another episode of the React Native Radio Podcast. Episode 308, Coding and ADHD with Chris Ferdinandi.
Hey everyone, I'm Jamon, your friendly CTO of Infinite Red, and today we have a very special guest, Chris Ferdinandi. Chris is a software developer and the host of the ADHD FTW podcast, which you can find at ADHDforthewin.com. Chris, welcome. Really happy to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Jamon, thanks so much for having me here today. So as you mentioned, I'm a web developer. I have ADHD. I professionally, I consult with clients. I teach people front-end development, so a lot of course creation, workshops, publish several daily newsletters, and really early in my career, and not so early in my career, I felt like I couldn't get anything done. I was pretty confident I was going to get fired from my first job because I struggled so much to get stuff done. And since then, I've discovered a bunch of systems, techniques, and strategies that have helped me turn my ADHD into a superpower. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes it gets in the way, but every now and then it just really works to my advantage. So I have recently been spending a lot of time and effort talking more about my ADHD experience because I think it makes me different, but not worse. And I meet a lot of other developers. I find that for some reason, the development profession seems to attract a lot of folks with ADHD, and a lot of my students have ADHD, and a lot of them kind of have internalized some negative feelings about it. So a lot of what I'm trying to do now is help people realize that it can actually be an asset, not a liability.
Yeah.
If you know how to channel it. It's not always easy or natural to do.
Yeah, this resonates a lot with me, and I'm going to go into why in just a second here. Before we get to that, I do want to mention that this episode is sponsored by my company, Infinite Red. We are a premier React Native consultancy. We are fully remote in the US, a team of 30 plus, senior plus React Native developers and support staff, and have been doing this for nearly a decade now. So if you're looking for React Native expertise, hit us up, infinite.red/React Native. And don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. Okay, so I mentioned this is very special to me, and the timing is perfect. Could not have been better timing. When we connected on potentially doing this episode, I was in the process of getting evaluated for ADHD myself. And that was an interesting journey. And I even wrote about it on my blog on jamon.dev. I was diagnosed with inattentive, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the types and whatnot. So if I space out and start ignoring you at some point during this episode, Chris, don't worry. It just means you're not being interesting enough. That's all.
Been there. Yep.
And I also have, my wife also has ADHD, and unsurprisingly, because it does run in families, we also have two daughters who have ADHD. So this is something that has impacted us quite a bit. And I've been doing a lot of research and self-education, but I'm not going to pretend that I know nearly as much as you. And of course, I do want to mention, as far as I know, there are no doctors on this call. So, always talk to a medical professional. This is our journeys. This is our journeys and what we've learned. Always go and talk to people who know what they're doing. But we have learned quite a bit. And Chris, you know a lot more than I do.
Maybe not. Because you mentioned your blog post that you wrote about your kind of journey. I have combined subtype, and again, we can get into this, but so I also have the hyperactivity, but a lot of what you described in your article and your experiences, both early childhood and as an adult, really resonate with a lot of what I experienced as well. And I do want to mention that everybody's ADHD experience is a little bit different.
Yes.
Because it's a collection of stuff and not everybody has everything. It's a little bit like autism in that regard, and that there's kind of a spectrum of symptoms that you may or may not have. But yeah, your experience resonated with me a lot. You I think you definitely know your stuff. Your article was very detailed. I can tell you hyper-focused on it when you wrote it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So anyways, I want to say I don't downplay how much you know, because I think you've clearly kind of been in the weeds of it for a little while now. That really came through in your writing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. When you talk about what resonated like when you were a kid and stuff, like what are you talking about there? What types of things do you think back and associate with ADHD as a kid?
So the thing that I think the biggest hallmark or the biggest difference between your experience and mine is that, and so actually, if you don't mind, if we could step back for just a second, I want to define this for folks who don't kind of have that background with ADHD, or they're kind of a little curious about it. So the thing with ADHD is that it is really badly named because it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And you touch on this in your article, but people with ADHD do not have a deficit of attention. They have difficulty regulating it. It's a type of executive dysfunction. So I almost have like an excess of attention, and it is sometimes squirreled in like 18 different directions, which I think what like people stereotypically think of as ADHD. But then there are a lot of times where it is like overly focused on just one thing. Sometimes that one thing is like a really important work thing and you get a ton of stuff done. Other times you're hyper focused on this other more interesting thing, and it can create some challenges around getting the stuff you want to get done. And within the ADHD kind of diagnosis, you have three subtypes. Again, you mentioned this in your article, but you have inattentive, which historically in like the 80s, 90s would have just been called ADD. Hyperactive / impulsive, because this type, obviously, as the name implies, it's, you know, that kind of that bouncing off the walls, but not always. Sometimes you may have this subtype, but you tend to just lack the impulse control, and you're not what someone might classically describe as hyper. And then there's combined subtype, which is what I have, where you have both of those things. The type you have, incidentally, if you read about this, you'll often read that it's more common in women. And as a result, women are often underdiagnosed. But there's part of me that wonders if that's strictly true, because I'm hearing about lots and lots of adults who are just now getting diagnosed as adults, and it's often with inattentive subtype. And often those adults are men. So there's part of me that wonders if it's one of those just like medical bias, kind of people looking for a particular thing and ignoring another thing, kind of. Anyways, we can dive into all that. But long story short, I have combined subtype. So I was diagnosed as a kid because I was like that kid in class. Really hyper, disruptive to my fellow students, super high energy. I did well in school, mostly because I had my parents kind of on my back all the time. But like subjects that I was really into, I would just absolutely crush. And then subjects that I wasn't, I would do relatively poorly in. And I also kind of had this other thing where if I knew a topic really well and I was ahead of other people in that topic, I would then be really bored and start to get disruptive or not want to do homework because I already know this. So why am I doing the same stuff over and over again? This is boring now. I want something new and challenging. So that was really tough. One of the other things you talked about was kind of like the procrastination aspect of things, right? So I can remember in college, I had this one class I was in where the grade was entirely based on your exams and not the lecture. Like showing up for class just didn't count. And I found the lecture really boring because the teacher was literally just reading slides. So I'm like, all right, I can just go do this at home or at my dorm, and I can just show up for the exams and not have to do this. Well, I can remember when it was around exam time, I was like, all right, I know this is going to be coming up soon. When is the exam? And it was literally the day before. And I had just completely missed it, and I hadn't been showing up for class. Yeah. So I was like, there's no way this dude's going to let me, you know. So I had to drop the class, right? Because I was going to fail it. Just lots of like little things like that. I also remember once I had like in college, like just a college part-time job interview. Popped by a friend's dorm room because I had 15 minutes until I had to leave, and they were watching a movie. And then they just started it. And then the credits for the movie rolled, and I looked down at my watch and realized that I had missed the interview by like an hour and a half. An hour and a half. Because I'd forgotten all about it. I just got sucked in, right? So it's just like lots of little stuff like that. So that was very much my early life experience. I was diagnosed as a kid, but never treated, because back in the 80s, treatment for ADHD was basically just Ritalin. It was often overprescribed. And I don't mean like they gave it out to too many people. I mean, they still hadn't quite figured out the dosing. And so my mom, who was a teacher, had seen a lot of kids who, like, their dose of Ritalin was so high that they were like very, zombied isn't the right word, but like they just didn't have that like spark they had before they started taking medication. And so that even carried with me into adulthood, where I was resistant to try medication for a long time, because that was my perception of what the ADHD medication experience was like.
I want to get into the medication side really deeply, because I resonate with that quite a bit. And this has been part of my journey as well. Because at first, like, my daughter was prescribed Adderall, and I'm like, screw that. I'm not giving her that. Like, no way. This is my 16-year-old daughter. Right. And, I've learned quite a bit. I want to go back and just say, yes, absolutely. I didn't have like the disruptive part, although really maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, because what I would do, and it wasn't like disruptive necessarily to the students, but I would argue with teachers. And maybe this is just a personality thing, but I think it had something to do with me being bored, and like, them in class, like saying something and me seizing on it and being like, that isn't right. And this kind of tendency to like lock in on a conversation and want to like really, argue it to death has been something that's plagued me my whole life. And I've really worked on it. I've really worked on it to try not to be like that, because it's not a good tendency. It really isn't. It can be good in some things, like my bullheadedness and like hyper focus on stuff was really good for coding. Like, it was amazing, because there would be these situations. So I talk about this in my blog article, and I'm sorry, listeners, we keep talking about this blog article that you probably haven't read, that you can feel free to go read if you want, jamon.dev. It's on my blog. But essentially, I would get sucked into programming in QBasic. I would make games and stuff, and I would have a problem. Now, I didn't know a single programmer. Well, I knew one programmer. He was an incredibly smart guy who lived in San Francisco, a long ways from me, and I'd see him like a couple times a year. And I thought that's what a programmer was, and no way I could ever be that. But I was like making games, and I would get really sucked into it, and then I'd have a problem. It's like, how do I make this spaceship shoot at another spaceship in a way where the laser hits it, at the right time? Like I'm learning about like leading the target, right? And I'm thinking about the math. How's the math work on this? And I'm like this is all my brain is working on all day at school. Like, I'm not thinking about what the teacher is saying. I'm just thinking about, how do I get this bullet to hit this other spaceship? And I'd go home and like excitedly try things and stuff. And that bullheadedness of like, I'm going to figure this out. This is going to be something I'm going to try everything I can. And I did. I eventually figured it out. And it was like, trigonometry. I'm learning trigonometry as a kid because I'm like trying to figure out how to make a space game, and I want it to be cool. And so those are the types of things that, now, procrastination for sure. Time blindness, like you talked about, where you don't notice the passage of time, like supposed to be somewhere. Oh shoot, and so I've built all these things into my life, these strategies, these structures, these I use timers, when I just noticed myself doing this yesterday. I just realized that I didn't do the thing I was supposed to do. Yeah. Okay. I put a timer going. I'm like, okay, I'm putting water in my pool. Luckily, I bought a timer that shuts off the water.
That's smart.
Yeah. It's like, you can only turn it up to 2 hours, and then you have to go back and turn it more if you want more. Because I've just sat there overfilling the pool for 2 days sometimes, just water spilling out of it, not remembering that I had the hose going. Well, the hose is still on, but the timer shut it off probably. But I on my watch, I like do a Siri timer. So, but I don't just do the timer, because when it goes off, I have no idea what it is. Like, there's a timer for something. I have no idea. So I'll actually name it. Like, there's a way you can name it too. So little things like that. I'm doing stuff like that all the time. And this has been throughout my life. And I just thought it was, my personality. It never crossed my mind that I would have ADHD. Like, ADHD was the kids who, did all the other things. It was probably the Chris's of the, the classroom that I was thinking of, but it wasn't me, but that's not true. It presents differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, that very stereotypical experience.
So what's like and for those who are listening, we will get to like how this relates to developers too. This is this is a podcast aimed at developers, but I want to ask, like, what causes ADHD, like underlying cause?
Yeah, you're born with it. So I just want to, for clarity's sake, that's probably not what you were asking, but right, like it's not like the kind of thing like, oh, you got a vaccine and I have ADHD or something like that.
Yeah.
But so they're not 100% sure, but one of the kind of the hallmarks of ADHD from a biological kind of perspective is that our brains do not make enough dopamine, and so a lot of the things that you see related to ADHD are often tied into that. So even things like time blindness. So ADHD folks often have a complete inability to perceive time as it actually happens. So sometimes it feels like it goes way faster. Sometimes it feels way slower. If you ask someone how long a thing took, folks with ADHD often cannot accurately tell you. And while everybody experiences that to some degree, like the whole like time flies when you're having fun, it is just an ever-present thing for us. And they're even finding that may actually be related to kind of dopamine and its role in how brains perceive time. So we don't make enough of it. And almost all of the ADHD medications are in some way related to either getting your body to produce more dopamine or keeping the dopamine you do make in your brain longer before it gets like intaken, whatever the word is there, absorbed by your brain, so that it floats around a little bit longer between your receptors. Yeah, and so that's kind of that's the underarching thing, and it drives a lot of ADHD behaviors.
And dopamine gives you pleasure, satisfaction, and motivation. Like those are some of the main things. It probably does other things too, but like those are some of the main things. And when you think of like the underlying, like this sort of like searching for something to keep our attention type thing that happens, or stuff just like taking our attention away. Mm-hmm. It kind of is related to that. And obviously procrastination, there's motivation there. I know for my wife, a big part of her ADHD, how it presents is on the motivation side. And then, like trying to get started, like, hey, I got a bunch of stuff to do. And it's just like, it's tough. Where now that she's been treated, it's not an issue. And she's been thinking like her whole life that she's a failure because she can't get going on stuff. And now it's like, no, I can do it if I have enough dopamine in my brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of, so like one of the things I've observed is that web development seems to have a disproportionate number of folks with ADHD in it. And I'm increasingly convinced that coding itself is really pleasurable to the ADHD brain. So if you think about the kinds of things that cause dopamine spikes in an addictive way, like social media, video games, and I don't mean addictive always in the negative sense, like gaming isn't inherently negative, but it does have a bit of an addictive aspect to it. And a large part of that is the feedback loop where you do a thing, immediate like reaction happens in the environment that makes you happy, you do more of it. And coding, at least when coding is working, even when it's not working well, but like coding in general has a lot of that, where you write some code, it either works or it doesn't, you get that immediate feedback loop. If it works, yay, awesome, I'm happy. If it doesn't, ooh, debug mode, let's go figure out why this isn't working. And that can become its own kind of like spiral of problem solving. So yeah, it's one of those things where I really truly believe that ADHD and web development go together very well. It can be a really rewarding profession, and if your environment is set up for it, it can really play to your ADHD strengths very, very nicely.
Okay, you've got my brain going, because I'm thinking about this is a whole nother episode, but like open source and how some people are so active in open source and they almost feel like super compelled to do it. And it's like, I bet there's a significant proportion of people who kind of hold up the whole open source world who are in some respects kind of addicted to it in an ADHD way, where it's like they love coding open source is awesome because there's no customer really. It's like you just doing what you want because you're not getting paid for it. So who cares, and wow. Yeah, that's a whole nother episode. But because I was one of those, I don't really do much of open source as much anymore, but I did a ton over the past decade, and it was very much a lot of that. And wow. Yeah. And I can see other things too. Like a lot of developers really love to have like perfect TypeScript types and stuff like that. And maybe like practice things like TDD and whatnot. And these are all like, there's objective, you can objectively look at them and give, these are good things. These are things that do help us as a profession, but also there's that immediate feedback loop, and it also helps with the debug. Yeah, I can see this. This is a lot of pieces are kind of coming in and fitting together.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing too is coding goes well when you have opportunities to focus kind of deeply on things, where you get into that flow state. And one of the kind of the hallmarks of ADHD is ADHD hyperfocus, where you become really, really fixated on a thing and dive super deep into it. And when the stars align and that's going well and it's focused on something you want to be doing, you can almost have like superhuman levels of productivity. I can remember in my last job, there was this month where I did like 6 months worth of coding in a 4-week period. And you can't really keep that up all the time, or you will absolutely burn yourself out. And that's precisely what happened to me. I had like a month and a half of just really terrible productivity after that. But like if you think getting into the zone as a programmer is fun, it's like it's even more when you're in hyper focus mode, like even more so. You just become like incredibly productive.
Yeah, I mean, when I was starting my business almost 20 years ago, I would work very late because nobody was bothering me, and I could get into that flow state and that hyper focus. And, I was incredibly productive during that time, making up for sometimes not being very productive during the day because I was jumping from thing to thing. And luckily in my position now, like that ability to jump from thing to thing is kind of rewarded. I'm not really like in a position where productivity is the most important thing. It's more like responsiveness and kind of being in sort of like touch with the whole, 30 people. So in some ways I've kind of like built the company around my ADHD and how it works. But I had a little thought here, and maybe you have some ideas on this, Chris. Do you think that developers with ADHD actually code differently? Like their code actually ends up being different. Maybe they have shorter or longer functions. Maybe the types of tools they like to use are different than those who do not have ADHD.
I don't know if the code itself ends up being different. So the challenge for me with answering this question is my whole career, I've been really focused on vanilla JavaScript. And a big part of the reason why is that I have found tools like React, no offense to the folks listening here, but I found them really confusing to wrap my head around. Just like the learning curve on them I found particularly steep. And I found that a lot of the students that I interact with have those same kind of biases. And I don't know if it's ADHD related or just the kinds of people that are naturally attracted to what I do because of, just for reasons, personal preferences, whatever. But what I have found is less around the type of code and more related to kind of the learning process itself, right? So there are certain types of kind of tutorials or explanations or learning styles that just don't work as well for a lot of the folks I talk to who have ADHD. Stuff that is longer form in nature, right? So like a lot of courses out there are like 80 hours of tutorial videos. And for a lot of folks with ADHD, that's like the opposite of what you want. It's like, oh, that's a lot to get through. I'm going to get bored, right?
Yeah.
There are certain tech educators in the space who are very good at it and very engaging and have huge audiences, but their style tends to be like very comprehensive. Let me cover everything you need to know about this one topic. And I found for a lot of my fellow ADHDers, what they really want is just enough to get started, and then I'll get to like a deep dive later.
Yeah.
So kind of the maybe less the output and more the inputs that get you there tend to be a little bit different.
I wonder if there's a significant portion of my audience here in this podcast who listens to it because we do hit like high points and, various things about React Native. Because we'll be like, hey, we're going to look at, I don't know, reanimated, like for animations and stuff. And we'll just talk about like the high level stuff. And then, in one 30-minute podcast episode where we're kind of joking and having fun and like, trying to make it interesting, they get the enough information that their brain kind of knows where to go next, and kind of gets them pointed a direction, and then they can go. That's very interesting. So I do want to talk about medication and other forms of treatment. Now, the first step, though, if you think you have ADHD based on some of the things that we've said, maybe resonate with you, or whatever, like you'll probably need to be evaluated. That's number one. You're going to need to have someone actually take a look. And I do know, like my primary care physician was more than willing to evaluate me, but I didn't actually really want him to. I actually wanted to go to a specialist.
I want to talk about that for a minute, if you don't mind.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm of a slightly different, well, it depends. So I guess a couple of threads here. The first is my primary care was really difficult about, I had already had a diagnosis as a kid. It somehow did not end up in the medical record that is with my adult medical stuff. And my primary care doctor just flat out refused to kind of evaluate me or do any of that. And she was really of kind of the whole like, oh, Adderall is super addictive. I don't want to go anywhere near this. You need to talk to a psych. And for me, I've had look into getting ADHD medication on my to-do list for 3 years. And I just finally set up an appointment last week to do it. Because my ADHD means like part of that is I hate phone calls. Like a phone call could take me 3 minutes to make, and I will put it off for weeks, months, years. And so someone might be, oh, you just call a psych, you make an appointment, not a big deal. But for me, that meant go to my insurance provider, look up people who actually do this, make sure I find someone that I think I'm going to get along with or who specializes in ADHD. And I'm someone who's like ADHD positive, so I don't want to get paired up with like a psych that's going to be like kind of negative about it. And then I need to call, then I need to make the appointment, then I need to show up for the point. It's like easily a dozen different steps. And the thing that finally got me over the hurdle was I found a psych who had fill out a form and they contact you on their website. I think you mentioned this in your article as well. Like you had a similar thing. That was literally the thing that did it the best for me. I've talked to friends who have been like, I just talked to my primary care. They asked me a questionnaire and then wrote me a prescription. I was like, that's what I wanted. That would have been, I'm already there. Like this would be so easy. But the other thing I kind of wanted to mention is obviously if you want medication, talking to a professional is kind of the thing you need to do. But I also don't think there's anything inherently wrong with completing, because if you go to like Attitude magazine, they have like a self-assessment you can do. And I think if you want to do that as a first step and you go through that and it says like, yeah, you probably have ADHD, and then you start learning about ADHD and you're like, these things all feel like me. Like, I don't know that you inherently need to go the next step and get a formal diagnosis if you're not at the point where you're like, I think I'd like to try medication, because there's a lot of other stuff you can do. Like, I think medication with behavioral stuff is kind of the win-win for a lot of folks. But I don't think you necessarily need to go there to start your learning about ADHD journey, nor do I think it's necessary for everyone all the time, depending on where you're at.
Absolutely. I didn't jump straight to it either. And I was doing a bunch of research. I liked Healthy Gamer. It's Dr. K on YouTube, who's like really, what I liked about him was his audience is gamers. So like he's not talking like, he's a psychiatrist. He knows his stuff, but like he's talking about it in terms that resonated with me. And so that was good. I my wife, who was going through this journey before me, really, even though I would say my ADHD is in some ways more severe in some ways, I guess, than hers. I guess I shouldn't say that, but it felt like maybe more obvious. Her therapist had recommended the book. I think it's called How to ADHD, and so she actually bought the audiobook, and then I didn't listen to the whole thing. She listened to the whole thing twice, and then I listened to the like half of it, and it really resonated. And then she also highly recommends the book How to Keep House While Drowning, which isn't necessarily specifically about ADHD, but I think it people with ADHD would be a primary audience for that book. And so I was doing those types of like self-research of like what even is it, and how does it present. And as I mentioned, like my doctor, I think, would have been more than happy to evaluate me and prescribe something. One of the problems with my doctor is he's more than happy to evaluate me and prescribe anything. And it makes me a little nervous sometimes because he's a little bit loose with it. Kind of the opposite of yours, like where he's just a little overconfident maybe sometimes. Okay. And I've tried to find someone better and haven't found anybody better. But so I do tend to lean on specialists more when I think there is something. He's good for if, I need something more simple. So I actually found a local ADHD treatment center. And if you're going to be looking for one, you can simply Google ADHD treatment center, in your area and see like what's out there. Some of them may take your insurance. We're talking US based here. Obviously there's different things, different countries. But they specialized in diagnosis, and treatment of ADHD. So you like scheduled an appointment through their app. They actually use a chat app in this case, which was awesome. Like I love chat. So that was perfect. They chatted me back and I ignored it. And they chatted me back and I ignored it. And then they texted me. The lady actually texted me. Yeah. She's like, hey, I need you to fill out these forms. And I was like, whoa, okay, that is going above and beyond. Like that's actually like taking an alternate means of communication. Like, hey, I really need your attention right now. Person with ADHD probably. And yeah, then I had to fill out some forms, and that was not easy, but I kind of hyper-focused and got through it. And because I was like, I'm dealing with this. I'm 42 years old. Like this is ridiculous. I'm gonna deal with this.
Yeah. I had so the place I went through, they called me back, which was great. And then like, we need you to fill out these forms. I think you mentioned in your article a similar experience with the forms where there was a lot of repeated information. A lot of it either felt unnecessary or was just like, it was just a lot is the best way I can describe it. Right. It was like, what is your spouse's name? What do they do for a living? What is their, like, how is that relevant to it? Right.
Yeah,
like this just feels like a waste. And then you would get asked that multiple, what's their contact information? Like, so that part was annoying. I did the forms right away because I knew if I didn't, I would forget them. And
another strategy. Yes.
And they were like, it wasn't like, we'll follow up with you. It was like, if you don't fill them out by this date, we're just going to cancel your appointment.
Yeah. Like, they told me the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. They're like,
that feels
you
bad.
better do this.
So I'm going to do this now because it took me 3 years to do this in the first place.
I know. Right.
So,
yeah.
So, yeah. One thing, so I don't have medication yet. I have seen the experience that other folks have had with medication, friends, family, and that's a big part of what convinced me to pursue it for myself. I had a friend describe it as like, because I have bad eyes. I wear contacts usually. He's like, it's like when you put on glasses for the first time and suddenly all this stuff that you didn't realize was fuzzy to you comes into focus.
Yes.
It's not like, it's not changing you. It's just making it so you don't have to work quite as hard to see the same stuff that other people see.
The glasses thing is really good because like I play hockey without my glasses. Like I have good enough eyesight that I can play hockey goalie without glasses and do okay. I'm fine, But the first time I put in glasses, I was like, holy cow, I'm not straining to see. I just see. Yeah. It's not, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to squint. I don't have to, and because I have like astigmatism and like, so that's a perfect analogy. Yeah. And that's how I would describe it. Now I'm only a month into it, like the medication. And I take two types. There's non-stimulant and there's stimulant, and you can certainly try one or the other or neither, and obviously your doctor will help you with that. The non-stimulant, I don't know how it works. I don't know that they know how it works, but it actually helps. The one I'm on, guanfacine, actually helps lower blood pressure, and I need that. So,
nice.
Win-win. And it also, and it counteracts the stimulant, which raises your blood pressure. So you kind of get an interacting thing that is a good thing, kind of keeps it neutral or even a little below. And then they both treat the ADHD. It kind of makes you, I guess, a little calmer. And then the stimulant, from what I understand, promotes dopamine, and there's another hormone in there too that is around like alertness and whatnot. And most people have heard of Adderall and Ritalin. There's a new one called Vyvanse that is out there, and there's extended release and there's like short-term release. And short-term is like 3 to 5 hours, and extended release could be like 12 hours. So like my Vyvanse only comes in extended release. So like I took it this morning right before this, so I'll be till 8 p.m. I'll have the effects of it probably later. Like any medication, it can have side effects. So for example, I don't sleep as deeply, and I do wear out Apple Watch to bed just to monitor that. I don't quite get as much deep sleep. I still feel fine, but it's just something to keep in mind. A close friend of mine is also starting this journey, and she said it was like being on really a lot of like caffeine in some ways to her, but without the anxiety or anything like that. So that was interesting, like her first encounter with it. But yeah, it definitely just like sharpens my focus. It actually makes me feel more calm. It's not like it like makes me all amped up, like unless I'm on too much. I have had some concerns around addiction because I've heard this over the years, many, many years, around like the potential for abuse. And there is drug abuse in my family. And so like, I've wanted to be really careful with this. This is an amphetamine that we're talking about here. So yeah, that's been something I've been researching quite a bit too. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, my immediate kind of thinking around this, because my primary said the same thing. It was a big part of why she didn't want to like prescribe this to me. And like, so if you're someone who has ADHD, I personally, again, caveat, not a medical doctor, yada, yada, yada. But I don't feel like that concern is there the way, because it's not affecting you, like it's not like meth or cocaine or something like that, the way like it would be for someone who doesn't have ADHD. It's making the dopamine your brain doesn't naturally produce. And so many of my friends who are on like Adderall or Vyvanse have to set reminders, like multiple reminders, to remember to take their ADHD medication in the first place. It feels like one of those, and I'm not in any way trying to invalidate your concerns because I understand family history and all that.
Absolutely.
But when I hear medical professionals get weird about ADHD meds for folks who have ADHD, it feels like one of those things where you're punishing the people who need the medication because of the folks who don't and abuse it. And that doesn't like that bothers my inherent like sense of fairness.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to mention this. So, and I think my brother would be fine with me saying this because he's very open about his like his past and whatnot. So my brother was a heroin addict and thankfully been clean for over a decade now. But he also has ADHD and probably more, I would say, the combined type, if I'd guess. I don't actually know for sure. But he says, like, if anybody should be abusing it, it would be him, after his history, right? Like being a heroin addict with, he tried everything, meth, everything, and he said, he's not at all compelled to abuse the Adderall he's on. It actually almost reduces the urge to abuse because like a lot of it was like self-medication. He was medicating this severe ADHD he had without really knowing it. And so like in a way it was like, now that doesn't mean that there isn't a potential. And obviously Adderall is a controlled substance for a reason because, people do abuse it. But what he said was it's like, there's this euphoria if you take a bunch of it all at once, like the quick release stuff. And to him, he's like, it's not even fun. Like, it's not even fun. It's like, you know, like you get that euphoria, but then like, you know, then you're just like jittery and it's like not good, you know, like, so, that would be like an extreme example.
Another aspect of ADHD is like impulse control, bad decision making. Adderall helps reduce that. I think again, you mentioned this in your article, but folks who take ADHD medication, more recent studies have shown have a longer lifespan, are at less risk for a whole slew of things. And I'd imagine that's a big part of it. You know, so hearing that you're less likely to abuse, or that your brother's experience was that he's less likely to abuse when he's medicated for his ADHD makes perfect sense to me. I don't find that at all surprising. Now,
for my daughter, I think if she wasn't pretty much full grown already, I would have more reservations, because the stimulant medication in particular can have an effect on growth rate. So I wouldn't want to artificially affect my kid's growth rate in any way. Like, that just does not sound like a good idea. I'm not like being judgmental toward parents who have made that decision, because I'm sure there are factors that are like, in this case, it wasn't like it just felt like, you know, waiting until she was 16 and fully grown basically is like, okay, yeah, now we can start the medication. And after I did all of the research and everything, we did go that direction. For the younger girls that I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. I don't think I'll do that. Not for a while. You know, if they need something, there's other options that you can do. Therapy, the non-stimulant kind of medication, which is much more, I would say, gentle and lower side effect and whatnot, and other things. You know, the things that you and I, Chris, have done our whole life to cope with our ADHD, right?
Yeah, I will say though, school for me was kind of hard mode, and so I am not in any way trying to dismiss the kind of the valid concerns around medication.
I want your perspective.
I am even for younger kids. I am medication positive, I think would be the right way to describe it. I also think that for younger kids, doctors are generally, depending on your pediatrician, a lot more cautious and a lot more like, we're going to check in on this all the time, around, you know, kind of making sure there's no, you know, like weight loss obviously is like a really big one, because it is a stimulant, you know, and things like that, mood, because it can, if you have things like anxiety, it can make that worse sometimes in certain people. So, I'm glad you brought that up, because, weight loss has been an effect for me of Vyvanse, and I've struggled with weight since I was probably 22, something like that. You know, like before that, I was so active playing basketball and whatnot that it wasn't hockey and everything. It wasn't really a big deal. But then as I got older and more sedentary, now this is a common thing. It's not like it's an ADHD thing, but I kept being very frustrated with myself because I had a hard time with appetite. I would be like, I just ate like 2 hours ago. Why is my body telling me I'm hungry? You know, like what the heck is going on? And what I've kind of come to realize, at least this is my theory, and it seems to be borne out, is that I have a lack of dopamine. And when I eat, it releases some dopamine. It does. It's like a part of the process. The feeling of like pleasure and contentedness and whatnot. And it's also releasing, it's like energy. It's like I'm getting some energy from it. So my brain is like, hey, I want more energy because I don't have enough right now. I want more dopamine. I don't have enough right now. What's a thing that I can do that will do that? Oh, eat. So go eat, you know, go snack, go get some carbs, get some sugar, get something like that, you know? And I'm sitting here like, okay, I'm 6 foot, almost 6'5", like 6'4.5". And so I'm a big guy, but also being 260 pounds is way too much, you know, like this is hard on everything. Like being a big guy already is hard on my heart and everything else. Being a lot of, you know, being like 30 pounds overweight is not great either. So, it's just been something that, and I'm not the type of person to beat myself up. Like I really don't. Like it's not, I guess, a part of my psyche,
But that is the one thing that I would probably say I beat myself up about, is like, why can't I like control my eating? Why can't I do this? And when I got on Vyvanse, it was like, it suppresses the appetite, because it basically told my brain, you have enough energy, you have enough dopamine, and it's no longer sending out those hungry signals. I'm not feeling hungry. But you have to be careful with that, because if you don't eat all day and then it wears off, then you're going to eat everything in the pantry. So
that's fair.
I've really, and of course, because I have more kind of like discipline and whatnot when I'm on it, I'm like, okay, I will eat at noon. I will have a protein rich lunch. I'm going to have a good dinner before it wears off. And then when it wears off, it's not a big deal, because I've eaten enough and I can control for that amount of time. I'm not out of control.
Yeah. One thing that I do want to, if time allows, that I do kind of want to stress here is, I feel like we've talked a fair bit about like challenges, medication, how it fixes it. But I am someone who generally feels kind of positive about ADHD. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it can create some challenges, and it's nice to have tools to help with those. But I am also someone who thinks that ADHD can be used as a benefit, and that I personally like to work with my ADHD and kind of lean into it, rather than trying to fight it or work against it. And so, time allowing, I'd like to talk a little bit about what that looks like in a developer context.
Yes, exactly. And I want to weave in there, Chris, like the question, is ADHD a superpower? Because people will talk about it that way, including myself. And I have a love-hate relationship with that, because I kind of believe it and I kind of don't.
Yeah. So it's one of those things, right, where every strength has a corresponding weakness and vice versa. Right. And so, so the things that like, there are things about ADHD that absolutely are a challenge. And I do not want to, especially like, so I think my whole thing is that a lot of the challenges of having ADHD are not so much with the ADHD itself, and more that we operate in a world that is like social expectations and work expectations are built around the kind of the preferences and needs of neurotypical folks, not neurodiverse folks. It's not exclusively that, but a lot of it is that. And so you may have, like partners or people you care about in your life who are neurotypical, and your ADHD things are going to be frustrating as hell for those folks sometimes, right? Like especially as someone who has combined subtype, I have heard "you're a lot" my entire life. I'm like, in like social situations, I am often like an overexcited puppy that pees all over the floor, metaphorically. And
for me, I don't pay attention. So like I'll drift off in the middle of a conversation, which is really rude. It's really rude.
Absolutely. And I do that too. And like when I'm around fellow ADHDers, we feed off each other and it's great. Yeah. But when I'm in mixed company or mostly folks who are not, I can be irritating. Right. I'm like that. If you remember Finding Nemo, I'm like that fish, like they're running through their whole, like I'm water intolerant. And there's one kid's like, I'm obnoxious. Like that's me. Right. I'm that kid.
Right.
But as a thought exercise, I sometimes like to imagine if we talk to neurotypical folks the way they often talk to us, like saying things like, oh, you're too worried about boring stuff. You need to learn how to like have more fun, or you're too focused on the future. You need to learn to live in the moment, right? Like you need both. Like it's great to live in the moment. It's also great to have folks who think more about the future and plan and aren't quite so impulsive. And so all of this is a long-winded way of saying that I think a lot, but not all of ADHD traits can be beneficial in certain contexts for certain things. So, for example, our lack of impulse control naturally can have some detrimental things, right? Like it can lead to making really bad decisions and doing awful things with your life. But it also means that we are potentially a little bit more likely to take risks in a positive way. So if you're someone who's entrepreneurial, it can make you more likely to start a business, more likely to explore things, right? Yeah. I'm not saying all astronauts have ADHD, right? But the kind of folks who are like, yeah, blast me off to Mars, right? Are much more likely to be risk takers than the general population. Or like, oh yeah, cool. This like unexplored area of the country that like no one's been to before. Let's go check that out. Or, I want to push the boundaries of what you can do with this cool technology, right? Like that's neurodiversity in action.
I'm just like shaking my head. The audience can't see this, but I'm like nodding along with you, Chris, because I'm just thinking back to so many situations in my life where I just said yes impulsively to doing things, including things like starting a business. When I had a stable job, I had like little kids. It was not a good time to start a business, and I did anyway. Yeah. And like saying yes to my first conference talk, and I'd never been to a conference before. I was the first talk at a conference when I'd never been to a conference before. Stuff like that. Like, but I think part of it also for me has been a learning journey that other people don't have that, like I'll just be like, yeah, you should give a talk at the conference. And they'll just be like, holy crap, that sounds super scary. And I'm like, this sounds fun. This sounds interesting. This sounds like it'll keep my attention,
Yeah. One other thing, just as a strength. So like, I wrote an article over at ADHDforthewin.com recently about kind of playing to your strengths. And one of the things I talked about is like my time blindness makes agency work that follows a traditional like scope a number of hours and do them kind of model. I am terrible at that because I can't tell you how long something's going to take. I can't tell you how long it did take, right? Like it's not for me. But my brain's tendency to kind of bounce all over the place, poke at the edges of things, and then dive really deep on threads that I unravel makes me really good at creative problem solving. And so if you have novel problems that require creative solutions, and this is going to sound like I'm bragging a little bit, but like I crush that kind of work. Like that is my sweet spot. And then when you couple that with ADHD hyperfocus, like I can just do some amazing work in that kind of space. And so like if you're, if you're thinking about like rote kind of code where we're a WordPress shop and we only build websites for ice cream shops, and it's basically like we've got this template and we churn it out over and over again. Like that is just mind-numbingly terrible for a lot of folks with ADHD. But if you're like, hey, we've got this big hairy problem that like there's not like an off-the-shelf solution for, folks with ADHD can do that kind of work potentially better than the typical peer in their space because you're not as likely to take some zany idea and dismiss it out of hand because, hey, this is interesting. I want to explore it even if it seems like it might not work, right? One other thing that has been both a blessing and at sometimes a professional liability for me, that lack of impulse control means that I am much more likely to just say what I'm thinking without kind of that verbal filter. And in certain professional contexts, that can lead to things like I have insulted this piece of technology while the person who built it is in the room and I didn't stop long enough to think, am I insulting someone who's right here with me? Right. And so I've worked really hard on kind of like asking like, oh, where did this come from before I open my mouth on it. But it also means that I am the person who is going to always give you an honest opinion about something. And I have had like managers outright tell me they like to come to me for feedback on things because they know I'm not going to just yes man them the way other employees might, right? So if you harness that properly, that can be a really powerful and good thing for you.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that if you have employees or team members with ADHD and you recognize like who they are, instead of just they've been told they've been bad their whole life. Like they really have. I know this. And if you tell them, look, I understand where you're at. I understand what you struggle with, but I also understand what you're good at. And I value those things. Like you've got like an ally for life there. Like they actually, like I've seen this over and over where just having that care and that attention and like, hey, look, you the things you're good at, we value, and we understand the things that you're not good at. It just makes all the difference in the world. I have a question for you though, too.
Yeah.
Does medication kill that superpower?
I can't answer that for me personally yet because I haven't taken it.
Yeah.
But I have my appointment in like a couple weeks. But this was a question I asked a lot of my friends with ADHD who are medicated before before jumping into this. And, Jamon, I'd love to hear your experience with this too. But a lot of what I heard was more that, not that it kills that, and more that it helps you direct it in the direction you want when it doesn't want to do that. So like one of the things I struggle with now, there was a week where I had some really important stuff to get done and all I could think about was campers and RVs and researching them. And I am not joking. I had like two really important things on my to-do list. Yeah. And it would like 5 o'clock would roll around and I would be like, man, I spent the whole day researching RVs and I didn't do any of the work I needed to get done. Yeah. And my friends have told me that it makes it easier for you to take that hyperfocus and just bend it over this way instead of that way. That's not like a silver bullet. It doesn't kill your kind of your personality. I suppose it could in too high of a dose.
Yeah. Dosage, I think matters. Yeah.
Because I've observed that. I used to be a camp counselor. And I can remember like, one day, one of my students, like who was normally very quiet and subdued, like he came back to me with this really witty retort, and I was like, "Oh, dude, what's going on with this? This is cool. I really like this. Like, what's new?" And he had this like little like medical band bracelet that had his ADHD medication on it, and he told me they had like reduced his dose for the summer, and like he was like a totally different person. So I think he was on too high of a dose. So I've seen that, but it doesn't have to be that way. As you mentioned, dosing I think is very important.
It's super important, and also there's different types. Maybe Adderall's not for you. Maybe Ritalin.
Yeah, I've had friends who said it did nothing for them, but Vyvanse worked really well, or like non-stimulant worked way better for them than stimulant. But a lot of what I do professionally with kind of my ADHD for the Win project is trying to help developers learn what they need or how to set up their life, their environment, their working situation so that they can go into that hyperfocus around things that benefit them and the kind of life they want to lead better than they currently do now. Because a lot of the way traditional working environments are set up and the way a lot of managers manage teams just does not work for how our brains are set up. And so, part of that is if you're comfortable doing so, being honest with your manager or your employer about your needs and your wants. And part of that is just not asking permission and setting up your work situation in a way that works for you.
Well, I will say just my own experience. I know we're way long. The editors are going to hate us. But two
ADHD folks on one podcast.
I know, like not a great idea. Who decided this was a good idea? My experience so far with medication, and I'm still, trying to figure out the dosage perfectly, but people have noticed in a positive way since I went on it that I certainly have. I'm getting the right things done. I'm cleaning up a lot of loose ends. There's a lot of things where it's like this thing it's just been sitting on my plate forever. I've known it's been like an important thing. I just can't bear to look at it. And then I just did it. Like it was done and I moved on. And now you can end up in hyperfocus. Actually, it's been a little easier for me to get into hyperfocus, but I can just direct where it goes. Yeah. And so like, it's still sometimes hard for me not to go like work on the game that I want to make or whatever. Like, I still need to like plan out my day. There still needs to be other things. It's not a silver bullet, as you said. But I don't feel like, in fact, I feel like my creativity is at an all-time high right now. And Theo Brown, he told me that he feels that ADHD is a superpower, and this is his opinion, and you may disagree, but he feels like it's a superpower if you've built up a bunch of structures by not being medicated and then you get medicated because then you have those structures and you have the medication and you're kind of like in a really good place. You're not just leaning on the medication.
Well, I don't have enough experience with what, my whole life has been unmedicated up to this point.
Yes. Yeah. And me too. Yeah. Well, that's what ADHDFTW.com is all about. And I do encourage people to go sign up. I just signed up for it daily. Every weekday? How do you do that?
Okay, so
emails.
So fun, crazy. Fun story. It's actually easier than not writing daily.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The reason being that having to do something once a week is like, oh, this is the thing I need to remember to do. If I do it every day, it becomes a habit, right? So it's just how I start my day. And so initially it's not a habit, right? Like the first week or so, I'm like, I'm like, okay, got to remember to do this thing. And then it just becomes kind of this automated part of my day, and I don't have to think about it anymore. So I just take like 15 or 20 minutes, write a thing. It's usually very short, kind of has to be out of necessity. I do it that often.
Yeah.
I do the same thing over at gomakethings.com, my tech blog. For like 6 years now, I've been writing every single weekday over there, and it's just kind of part of the day.
I love it.
Yeah,
this is fantastic. I do need to wrap this up again.
Yeah,
I apologize for the length of this podcast, but man, I could literally go for another hour. I know I could. We're going to have to do a follow-up at some point, Chris.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you so much for coming on this podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jamon. I loved it.
It was a lot of fun. And I hope that the audience got something out of it. If you all have questions about this, feel free to reach out to Chris. Chris, what's your socials?
Yeah, so I have all of that. If you go over to ADHDforthewin.com/React Native Radio, I have a bunch of articles that build on some of the stuff we've talked about, as well as all my contact information, email address, social media stuff. I'd love to talk to you about this if you want to dig deeper into it, or you think you might have ADHD, or you have a specific question. Feel free to hit me up.
Or complain about his views on React. Any of those things are fair game.
Yeah, I'm always down, as you know. Arguing about tech is a fun part. I'm always down to argue about tech too. So
exactly. I'm trying not to argue as much. So, just send compliments to me. I appreciate it. You can find me at Jamon Holmgren. You can also find the show at React Native RDIO or reactnativeradio.com. Thanks everybody for coming along with us on this journey. And we will talk to you next time. See you later.
As always, thanks to our production team, with editor Todd Worth, our assistant editor, this guy, Jed Bartosky, our director of communications and episode release coordinator, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Derek Greenberg. Our producer and host is Jamon Holmgren, and executive producers and hosts are Robin Hines and Mazen Chami. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/reactnative. A special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe to React Native Radio wherever you get your podcasts. And leave us a review. We'd love to hear what you think.